If you follow election coverage, you already know that Andrew Yang has suspended his 2020 campaign for president. Andrew Yang ran a historic campaign, not just as the first Asian American male Democrat, but as the only candidate running with a flagship proposal of a universal basic income, also known as UBI. When I first heard about Yang and UBI, I scoffed at the idea. My bullshit meter went off, and I thought Andrew was just a random guy who wanted to buy my vote. I didn't even give him the time of day, let alone 15 minutes to vet his candidacy. Back then, I was just a regular Bernie Sanders supporter, and I wrote him off. I wrote Andrew Yang off completely. At the time, I was also unemployed, struggling to make ends meet. I went from one job interview to the next with no luck. I spent months on Glassdoor, LinkedIn, and Indeed trying to send out resumes to anyone who might take me. I went from aspiring for big positions at great companies to downgrading my dreams by applying for unpaid work. I was desperate for anything. I'd been in that hamster wheel for about a year, and I was losing my mind over positions that were either underpaid, had no benefits, or it wasn't at all related to what I wanted in my career. To label my emotional state at the time as depressed would be an understatement. I felt like I was drowning. I felt like if jobs didn't want to hire me, and then my value as a human was meaningless. If I can't help myself or my family in my own situation, what point is there in living? And that's when I first heard about Andrew Yang, a Taiwanese American entrepreneur from New York with no political experience running for president of the United States. Andrew appeared on a 2-hour episode of the Joe Rogan podcast 11 months ago, and that's when he introduced millions of Americans to the idea of universal basic income, a no strings attached monthly dividend provided by the government to every single adult. At first glance, UBI seemed like a half-baked promise with no real strategy. But the more Andrew explained this concept, the more I started to understand that there's something going on here. This isn't just about the money. You see, most people get hung up on UBI because they can't get past this idea of giving out free money. They always think that there's some sort of hook to it. But the brilliance of UBI isn't the money. It's the lack of conditions. What do I mean by that? Traditionally speaking, most welfare programs are means tested, which means if you want a particular benefit, such as food stamps or housing assistance, you have to qualify for it. In most cases, you need to make under a certain amount in order to qualify, or you have to jump through a series of hoops to prove to the government that you are deserving of this check. On top of completing dozens of confusing paperwork and going through a strict program that monitors how much money you make, only then can you receive your check. In most cases, the money you get is so embarrassingly low. I've met people on this page who have gone through the rings of fire just to qualify for a food stamp check worth $24 a month. Similar to the dehumanizing experience of applying for jobs and jumping through hoops just to get a shitty salary, the process of receiving government assistance is so difficult. Millions of people don't even qualify on paper. In real life, though, they definitely fit the description of a person in need. They might be struggling to find work, starving, homeless, or in need of severe help. But if they don't fill out the right form, if they make $1 over the income limit, or if the process is too confusing to understand because you can't understand English, or you don't have access to help from social workers, they just won't receive anything. And this doesn't even account for the millions of people who lose their benefits every year due to budget cuts. Known as the Freedom Dividend, Andrew Yang's UBI proposal was revolutionary because he wasn't just fighting for the working class. He was fighting for people who couldn't even find work to begin with. Andrew Yang fought for the working poor. Andrew Yang fought for the homeless, stay-at-home parents, seniors who couldn't afford to retire, and millions of workers who've been forced into a never-ending treadmill of unfulfilling side hustles. Even if all you did was peek under the surface, you could still see how much nuance and thought went into Yang's campaign. From human-centered capitalism, which was a policy that would have made companies responsible for investing and recovering so many of our social issues, such as climate change and affordable housing, to data as a personal property, realistic healthcare plans, and a revitalization of the arts. Yang had over 100 solid policies that touched on everything from mental health to police reform. For all the shit Democrats said about Andrew Yang not being progressive enough, I truly think Andrew Yang's platform was way more progressive and grounded in reality than Bernie, Warren, Buttigieg, or Biden. His appeal transcended party lines, and he scooped up endorsements from across the political spectrum. Andrew Yang had all the momentum, all the policies, and all the ideas needed to win. And he evolved from a long shot candidate to a top 5 contender with no political experience. At first, I didn't really mind people dismissing Yang because I knew eventually we'd be right. That didn't bother me. What bothered me was the wave of disinformation about Yang and basic income, most of which came from so-called progressives. People like Bernie Sanders and AOC, who had previously supported basic income, were now magically against it now that UBI was the flagship proposal of their opponent. Which I always found hilarious because UBI isn't even Yang's idea, and there was nothing stopping any candidate from adopting this plan. You know how many progressives lied to people and said that UBI would be this pointless plan because of inflation? You know how many people said and lied to people that UBI would actually cost them more money and that it'd be rendered useless because of, they're going to increase the rent by $1,000. Do you know how many people lied and said that Yang would kick people off of government assistance? And we're not even talking about the Yang Gang media blackout, which was a never-ending shitfest of media outlets, journalists, newspapers, and activists that erased Andrew Yang's name from election coverage. They left him off of graphics. They called him different names like John Yang and Andrew Yang. They used different photos of different Asian people. They would misrepresent how he actually looked by making him look shorter or changing the color on his face. They left him off ballots and news reports. They lied about his policies. He misrepresented his supporters, painting them all as if they're white supremacists. They completely ignored him every single time he went on the debate stage. I mean, Jesus Christ. Bill de Blasio and Thomas Steyer had more time to speak on the debate stage than Andrew fucking Yang. This was more than just the media disrespecting Yang as an outsider candidate. This was blatant erasure of a candidate of color. And it was so pathetic that at the last debate, the moderators called on the other white candidates to discuss race and diversity while they ignored Andrew Yang, the only candidate of color on stage. Don't get me wrong, I have my criticisms of Yang. For starters, I think he dropped the ball on many occasions when it came to understanding race and explaining it, even though I actually believe that he had a more nuanced understanding of race compared to the other white candidates. I also thought he could have done a much better job showcasing the diversity in his over 100 policy platform, but oftentimes he was just forced to have to constantly explain UBI because people were continuously misunderstanding it. I don't agree with his decision to not jail Trump, but I also understand the logic of why he didn't want to. I was opposed to the way that he phrased his initial immigration policy, although immediately after they actually changed it. To be frank, I had criticisms of Yang, but none of them were glaring enough that it made me question his fitness as a candidate for president. Upon investigation, all of his ideas were sensible, realistic, fair, and most importantly, they were new and transformative, and they were inspiring. And the best part of all this is Andrew Yang isn't done. Although he's out of the 2020 race, his story doesn't end here. If he doesn't get scooped up by another candidate, I expect him to return in 2024. As of now, I do not support any candidate. Andrew Yang shed light on the struggles of millions of Americans who we've ignored, and it would be against my own values to support a candidate who doesn't support a basic income for all. Just as you are supportive of healthcare, just as you are supportive of equal rights, I believe that basic income should be included in what we consider human rights. Obviously, UBI isn't the only thing that I want, but it is definitely my core policy. I didn't lie when I said I was a basic income activist. Regardless if Yang is running or not, this is an idea that needs to happen. And quite frankly, I'm not going to budge. Right now, none of the candidates on stage have me convinced. Warren pretended for years that she was a Native American. Buttigieg is in the pockets of billionaires. And at this point, Bernie seems like he's willing to say anything, regardless if he thinks it'll work or not, just so he can win. I don't trust any of these rich white folks. And until they can come out with an immediate solution to poverty and homelessness that doesn't involve forcing people to work for jobs that they don't want, then I unfortunately have no desire to endorse another candidate at the moment. And to answer your question, no, I will never vote for Trump. But that doesn't mean I'm going to support a mediocre progressive either.